So good morning, and thank you for attending this talk. I'm really pleased to introduce you to Emily Mroz. She comes to us as a doctoral candidate from the University of Florida, and she has award-winning research in the topic broadly of death and dying and how we use our own life stories to bring meaning and purpose to our lives. So she's going to talk with you about her research program, which uses qualitative research methods in order to better understand how we memorialize and reminisce and the purpose of these life stories in our everyday lives. So she welcomes questions either in the middle or at the end.
Yeah. If you have any questions, because I'll be going really quickly through the different research that I have, so if you have any questions about anything, just let me know. Yeah.
So, without further ado, I apologize for the pink projector. Apparently this has been a problem for a little while. We tried to give you a substitute. I broke it. So please welcome Emily Mroz.
So thank you all for coming out at 9:30 on a Friday to listen to me talk about death. I tried to wear my most bright, colorful dress to indicate that even though I study death, I'm trying to convince you that I'm a lively, fun person anyways, as if being friends with Carla wasn't already an indication of that. So like Carla said, I'm going to be talking to you guys about a few different research projects, 2 different research projects that I work on or have done in the past or are currently working on to try to understand death and dying. So I want to give a little bit of a larger framework. So I'm a developmental psychologist. And when I tell that to people, usually they assume that that means I study children or adolescents or toddlers, things like that. We're fortunate to know now that, or to research developmental psychology within this understanding of the lifespan, right? So we're actually looking at the development across the lifespan. And that's what most developmental psychologists kind of consider the best approach at this point. My program of research and my goal within the research that I do is to convince people that we're kind of missing a life phase or that we need to consider more poignantly the life phase of end of life, of death and dying. And so I'm lucky enough to be able to introduce the end of life as an important life phase to consider when you're understanding the entire lifespan and how end of life actually affects the different points in your lifespan, whether it's because you've lost a loved one at any point in the stage of your own development, or whether it's the fact that you're reconciling with the fact that you'll also reach the end of your life as well. So with that, I've kind of built a model with my program of research to understand what I call the stakeholders, the people who are involved in the end-of-life process intimately. And with that, there's kind of 3 different groups. So the first are the patients themselves, not necessarily always patients, but the people who are dying. So I kind of broadly call them the patients at end of life. And then you have the medical providers. This is also a really broad topic or area as well. So including the doctors, the nurses, the social workers, palliative care staff, but even things like chaplains, quality improvement specialists. So this is a really broad category that collects a lot of different people who are formally involved in the caregiving process at end of life. This can also, to a certain extent, involve the environment. So what type of environment are the providers introducing to the patients at end of life? And then the third group of people are the family and the loved ones. So the people who are also intimately involved in the end-of-life process because they are going through the death of a loved one at that time. So as I said, I've been fortunate enough to do some research in looking at each of these populations, so looking at patients, loved ones, and providers, and also looking at the intersection or the relationship between each of these groups as well. So I have research kind of in all of these areas, and that's helped me to build this really strong model of looking at the entire scope of end of life, or kind of who's involved and what's involved with the whole process. But today I'm just going to be talking about 2 main studies that I've done. So the first is a project that I've worked on in the past, and the second will be something that I'm working on currently that I'll introduce to you guys really briefly at the end. Okay. So I just want to touch on the methods that we use in my lab and that I use personally to study end of life. We use both quantitative and qualitative methods in my research lab. This is kind of one of the strong suits, one of the strong points of my research lab is that we're engaged in both data collection using surveys or polls of participants who come in. So this can be things like questionnaires, inventories, things like that, paper and pencil, self-report types of things. But we're also involved with qualitative methods, so gathering some sort of behavior or attitude or narrative that the participant presents to us, and then we would code that for different responses. So the first study that I'm going to be talking about just looks at the quantitative methods, or uses quantitative methods, so survey report, to generate the data that we have. The second study uses both quantitative and qualitative methods, and that's why I want to touch on that as well, because my lab is really heavily involved with qualitative research. Okay, so the first study that we're going to be talking about is a study on memorializing preferences. So when you are facing the loss of a loved one, how do you prefer to remember them, or how would you prefer to remember them when they die? And first I want to define, and I'm sorry that the text is a little hard to read, I hope it's okay, but I want to define memorializing as a psychosocial phenomenon through which individuals maintain a relationship with a lost loved one. And I want to pause here to clarify that when we study memorializing, we're not looking so much at complicated grieving, so rumination, really negative forms of remembering a loved one, as like being upset about their loss, but just rather looking at it as a normative thing. We all grieve if someone dies, and we all want to remember them. And so memorializing is theorized to allow a mourner to do a variety of different things, but importantly, to preserve in memory an intimate relationship that they have with the lost loved one. But we want to know with our research more about what guides this unique form of memory use, and it really is a unique form of memory use, so I kind of want to talk a little bit about that. So memorializing has this really unique set of memory parameters that make it different from other types of memory use. The first kind of parameter of recall when memorializing is that failure to recall has a high cost. So basically, the person who has died is really important to the person who's remembering them, and so failure to recall is really distressing. The second is that the target of your memory, of your remembering, will never be viewed again. So it's really difficult for people to understand how they're going to remember this intimate relationship or remember the experiences that they have with a person when they're never going to see them again. And in fact, a lot of people have it in their mind that they will have a chance to see them again in heaven or something like that, and so kind of that brings comfort. But this sense that as we are on earth, as we live for the rest of our lives, we want to remember them without ever being able to interact with them again. And the third is that we want to recall that person for an extraordinary length of time. So unlike other memory activities, where you know you can probably touch base with what the target was in the future, and kind of remind yourself of it, for this, we actually want to be remembering this person for the rest of our lives, again, without being able to interact with them again. So this really is a unique form of memory use, and that's why it's kind of important to understand how we, what kind of is involved in the process. So this is kind of something I want to open up to you all. We came up with, in my lab, 3 categories. We had theorized 3 categories for memorializing in populations. So what would you, as an individual who had lost a loved one, prefer to do when you were memorializing? And we came up with these 3 main categories, and I want to see if you have any insight into what might be involved with them. So the first is remembering a loved one generally through traditional rituals. So what do we think that might look like? Any ideas? This is kind of the easy one.
Like going to your grave.
Mm-hmm. So maybe going to their gravesite to interact with them even after they've died, to visit them, maybe bring flowers, something like that. Anything else? Yeah?
The Day of the Dead.
Okay, so specific cultural rituals, yeah, like the Day of the Dead, to remember them every year, wants to like celebrate their memory, yeah. Mm-hmm. What else do we do in our society, especially looking at like American society, Western society, what do we do as like a traditional ritual? Especially like considering particularly right after the death, yeah?
Funerals?
Yep, so having a funeral and a wake, things like that. So when we theorized about this category, we had a lot of these things in this category. So some of the things that I'm using as examples are writing an obituary for a lost loved one, going to their funeral or wake, and then yeah, visiting their gravesite and leaving flowers, or just visiting to touch base with them. Okay, this is going to get a little bit more tricky. So the next category that we came up with was to remember the person's life, the lost loved one's life, through everyday intimacy. So little acts that you can do to remember small components of their personality or of the interaction or of the experience that you had with them. So these are things that you could kind of do on an everyday informal basis to connect yourself to that lost loved one. Does anyone have any ideas or things that you might have heard of or done? Yeah.
Maybe like wear their clothes.
Okay, so maybe they passed on a piece of clothing and you're kind of integrating that into, you're either wearing it or integrating that somehow into your life. Yeah? Yeah?
I have a necklace that's a heart with my dad's handwriting on
Okay. Oh, okay, so that's really personalized because it's actual handwriting, yeah, and it kind of brings you back to a specific component of him. Yeah? What else? Yeah?
I have my grandpa's old license plate. It says like Brother John. It says like he's a veteran of like, it says like the 82nd Airborne. And so it has like little, I don't know, and he really liked his car. Like he polished that thing like
Yeah.
every day. So like for me to have his license plate is like something he loved.
It's a certain particular part of him. Yeah, exactly.
And then I also used to work at like a Thai restaurant, and they would give food to their ancestors,
Mhm.
you know, like ancestor worship. So they
Okay.
would always give them fresh food every day.
Okay, like any
the
type
shrine.
of food or
No,
a particular food that they liked or?
like rice or
Okay.
wine or just like whatever they thought was good that day.
Okay, yeah, just kind of including them into what they were doing on the daily basis.
Yeah, and then it'd always be like fresh morning food.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. Any
Follow
other?
their advice.
Follow their advice, okay, or maybe they're like, their ideas for you or their
Yeah.
ideas for how to live their own life, you kind of take that on, yeah. I don't have a picture of that, but that was one of the things that we included as well. So some of the things that we had were to just remember them looking at pictures or photographs or scrapbooks of particular memories that you had with them, maybe a vacation or a wedding or something like that. To eat or cook their favorite food, especially like on their birthday or something, maybe you make what they would have wanted to eat on their birthday. And then, yeah, wear a piece of clothing or jewelry or something that they've passed to you in some way or another. I actually usually wear my dad's earrings when I give presentations, but I didn't bring them. So these small things kind of like bring you back on an everyday basis, on a smaller basis to this person, so that you can kind of remember these small details of the experience and the relationship that you had with them and that you loved about being with them. All right, this is a little bit more tricky, but can anyone give me any ideas for how you would remember the loved ones dying? So the fact that they had died, and and people who do these types of things are reminding themselves and grappling with the fact that that person had died. So you're not just you're not remembering their life anymore, but you're actually specifically reminding yourself, okay, this person has died, they're gone, they're no longer here. And basically doing this to try to confront the loss and the fact that they had died. Yeah?
Visiting like the site or like the area where they might have died.
Okay, yeah, and one of the things that is a part of that is like roadside memorials, if someone had been in an accident or something like that, yeah.
Well, would it be like if somebody dies from like heart disease and then like trying to watch your weight or something like that?
Okay, that's interesting. That kind of includes multiple different categories in my opinion, because it has this everyday intimacy type of thing of like, I'm trying to avoid this thing because that's what they would want me to do, but it also is sort of honoring their legacy, which we'll get to in a little bit. So maybe that could kind of fit into this category as well, because I'm maybe afraid of the fact that they died this way, so I want to avoid doing that. What else? What do we think of like, trying to think specifically like a permanent thing that we do to ourselves to remember that someone has died? Tattoos, yeah. So things like that. And then, so the examples that I have are getting a tattoo specifically with the death date on it, birthday and death date, to remind yourself like this is when this person died. To create particular ornaments, maybe things that you hang at Christmas to remind yourself that the person's no longer with us, but they're still celebrated within this ceremony that we have. Or to have the ashes, to either keep them on the mantle in the living room, or some people even wear them in pieces of jewelry as well. So these are all things that we do to kind of particularly confront the fact that I loved them and they were alive, but now they're gone. Okay. So specifically when we ran this study, we wanted to look at the memorializing preferences of young adults. And we did this because we know that young adults have this abstract view of death. It actually develops earlier in childhood, but that they're currently developing this abstract view of their own identity. So they already know about death, and they already know about kind of main responses to it, how their parents would respond or how other people in the community or whatever. But at this point in a person's life, this is the first time that they're able to decide or for themselves how they would prefer to memorialize. And so this is why it's a very interesting life phase to explore in terms of memorializing, because for the first time we're seeing how would you really want to do it if you were making the decisions. And so we theorized, and we wanted to investigate about what would drive young adults' preferences for memorializing, and we theorized that their personal attitudes about death and their life experience thus far with death would both be large predictors of their memorializing preferences. And so the goal of this study was to delineate young adults' preferences for memorializing and then examine how these preferences are connected to their personal attitudes and to their life experiences with death. Okay. And so that's exactly what we did. We had 145 participants in this study, a basic average age range, 18 to 23 young adults, and then about 2/3 were female, 1/3 were male. Standard sample in terms of race for the community that we were sampling from. And then we recruited them through the psychology department participant pool, but also through the community to make sure that we were recruiting participants who had a variety of experiences with death, that we had recruited people who had lost a loved one in their life so that we could get the full range of responses for that. And all the participants came into the lab to participate in the study. To complete the study, it took about an hour for them to respond to all of the different measures that we provided. Okay. So I'm going to introduce some of the particular measures that we had the young adults complete when they came into this, to the lab. The first was this memorializing checklist. This is something that we developed for this study and is now published for other people to use. So basically we asked young adults to respond to the prompt, when a loved one dies, people sometimes do certain things in memory. Assume you are the person most responsible for making decisions about how a lost loved one will be remembered. Indicate how likely you would be to memorialize a loved one in each of the following ways. And we had 42 items total, and then they just rated it on a scale from 1 to 5. And here's some of the examples of items that we had. So planting a tree in memory, naming a child after a lost loved one. Okay. The second measure that we used, the first kind of predictor variable, were these personal attitudes. And so we looked at death attitudes in 2 ways. The first is this idea of acknowledging death, and it usually has a strong connection to a religious component. So the people in this study who had this higher death acknowledgement also had the stronger belief in the afterlife and felt more comfortable with the idea of death because they knew that they had this next place to go, or they knew that God was protecting them. And on the other hand, they had this idea of death resistance. So these are the people who had this anxiety about the afterlife and about death, due to the fact that they either feared it or they just avoided thinking about it at all. And so basically what we found was that people who were high in one category were really low in another, and that's pretty standard. The second variable that we looked at for predictive variable was those life experiences with death, and we did that in 3 separate ways. The first way we looked at life experience with death was just the straight up number of personal losses that you had had in your life. So anybody who you considered a lost loved one, we had the categories written out, so your mom, your dad, your sister, your brother, your grandparents, but then also you could write in if you lost a close friend or something like that. So you could indicate anyone who you thought was a close loved one that you lost, and then we also measured the amount of informal caregiving that you provided to that lost loved one, so how much you acted as a caregiver at that time when they were dying. And then we also looked at lost closeness, so the closeness that that individual felt to the loved one at the time that they were dying. So we kind of looked at life experience in a variety of different ways beyond just looking at the number of losses that you had experienced. Okay, so going on to the results first, again, we wanted to look at those memorializing preferences and see if what we theorized were these 3 different categories of preferences mapped onto what we found with the young adults who participated. So the answer is mostly yes. We found 3 preferences that mapped on really closely to what we had theorized. So this first idea of everyday intimacy with the life of the lost loved one, confronting loss, so connecting to the fact that they had died or their death, societal tradition, so following these normative rituals. And then we also found a 4th factor that came out of the exploratory factor analysis that we conducted, which was community legacy. And this is something that you were kind of touching on earlier, this idea of honoring the lost loved one for a particular part of themselves by maybe doing something in your own life to honor their death, or doing something in the larger community. So this would be things like naming a building. Maybe a famous doctor donated money to the college and then he passed away, so now we name a building after him, or leaving some other kind of legacy in the community, naming a park after someone, or building some sort of statue to honor them, things like that. So these really kind of loud public legacies. And these can be split, as you can kind of see, into these 2 different categories of this more private, intimate form of memorializing. This is just me connecting to my loved one who I've lost. And then these more public forms of memorializing. This is me and my community and whoever else wants to, connecting to the loved one who we've lost. Okay? And looking at, and then to kind of break down how they were rated by young adults in a way that seems kind of expected. Young adults were most likely to say that they would engage in societal tradition, so doing those funerals, obituaries, they're kind of expected to, and they know that, so that's what they said would be most likely for them. And they were least likely to do these confronting loss things, or say that they would do those confronting loss things, so reminding themselves of the death. Okay? Looking at predicting memorializing preferences and what kind of predicts your own preferences for memorializing, and first looking at death attitudes, we saw that the higher you were on death acknowledgement after running linear regressions, the more likely you were to say that you would prefer to engage in everyday intimacy, societal tradition, or community legacy. In contrast, the higher you were in death resistance, the more likely you were to say that you would engage in confronting loss. Okay? Looking at life experiences with death, we again found a similar pattern. The more likely you were to have lost, or the more lost loved ones that you had in the past, the more people who had experienced their death in the past, the more likely you were to say that you would engage in everyday intimacy, societal tradition, and community legacy. Personal losses didn't relate to confronting loss, but the amount of loss closeness you have did. And so the closer you were to someone who had died in the past, the less likely you were to say that you would engage in confronting loss. So again, in terms of how the data is related, or in terms of how these predictor variables are relating to these memorializing preferences, we're seeing this big split between everyday intimacy, societal traditions, and community legacy, and then confronting loss, this last preference. So there's something different going on here with this confronting loss factor than there is with these other three. And so that's what we kind of discussed. Next is, so first we were excited that we found the memorializing preferences that we had hypothesized, right? So these preferences mapped onto the hypothesized preferences that we had, but with one new preference, that community legacy that we hadn't considered, but that we were excited to find. In the final model of relating all of these predictor variables to the memorializing preferences, we found that there was this really big split between the first three and then confronting loss. And it seems like in terms of personal memorializing, or that intimate one-on-one memorializing, it might, what we didn't measure, but what we kind of suspect as a next step, is that confronting loss might be a less healthy behavior over time, or be connected to these less healthy death attitudes or experiences, and that memorializing preference, or as that everyday intimacy might be related to kind of this healthier form of memorializing. Okay? So after that study, and after conducting all of that and looking at the results, we now know a bit more about how people remember a lost loved one, how they would choose to, what their preferences are. But the next step for me, and a big part of what I'm going to be doing now in my research, is to look at why people remember lost loved ones. And specifically, whether remembering is even a good thing in the first place. So now we're getting a little bit into starting to suss out, okay, is this remembering helpful for me after I've lost a loved one? So now we're going to transition away a little bit from the young adults. So the second study, the study that I'm currently working on, is connecting reminiscing to post-loss outcomes. So now we're really looking at what happens to you psychologically after you engage in these, in recalling the lost loved one after they've died. So the big questions that we have to ask ourselves in order to answer this, the first one is, who's dying in our society? In general, everyone experiences the loss of a loved one, and they want to remember them. So this is a really common occurrence. Probably a lot of us have already lost someone that we loved, and if not, we will in the future. But more specifically, we know that, we know that about 2 million Americans die every year. So this is something that happens in our everyday society. But we know that older adults, as is kind of standard, are the most likely to pass away. And so over 20 million American older adults will die over the next 10 years. We also know that a lot of them are going to leave behind a bereaved spouse. So in kind of figuring out my next steps for my research, I wanted to specifically look at the spouses of older adults as the population that will be most impacted by loss, and that will also experience a loss most commonly. So now we know who's dying and who we should kind of look at, but we also wanted to look further into, where do people die? We know that about 3/4 of patients who are asked, where would you prefer to die, and most of their loved ones say that they would prefer to die at home, with some of them also saying that they would prefer to die in a hospice facility. However, we also know that about 3/4 of patients die in the hospital. Okay, so this is this big discrepancy. We know that a majority of people would prefer to die at home but are not dying at home. And in fact, a lot of times they're dying in an impersonal ICU or other really kind of sterile hospital setting. And we also know that this can be difficult for the dying person. So a person who's dying in hospital usually rates their satisfaction with the end-of-life process is way lower than if they were dying at home for a variety of reasons, which I won't get into right now. We also know a little bit about the fact that it's really difficult for the loved ones. And in part because these loved ones experience the loss in maybe an environment that's not conducive to the patient's wishes, but then once the patient dies, they have to continue to carry these memories of the death forward and recall the fact that they had died in this environment that was unfriendly or unwelcoming or not what that patient had preferred. So the model that I'm building right now connects all of these things together with memory as the central piece. So I'm looking at place of death as an important predictor of understanding the types of memories that individuals pull away from the end-of-life experience. And with that, this is where the qualitative coding is going to come in. We're going to be coding those memories for a variety of different things that I can talk about later if you want. And then we want to look at the relationship between place of death predicting these memory outcomes and how those actually then play into your post-loss outcomes. And with that, we want to specifically look at your feelings of being an effective caregiver in the future, your feelings of unfinished business with the person who died, right? We have this notion of unfinished business in our society of, oh, I wish that I had done this or told them this, or I wish they could be here for this certain thing. And then personal growth, so how likely you are to be able to grow from this loss experience. And we think that all of these relate to the memories that are being developed, which are based largely on the place of death. So this is kind of the next project that's coming up for me. So I want to end with a quote. This is one of my favorite quotes about end of life from British philosopher Alan Watts. And he says, everybody in their lifetime should consider death. That is a most gloomy thing for contemplation, but it's like manure. Just as manure fertilizes the plants and so on, so the contemplation of death and the acceptance of death is very highly generative of creating life. You'll get wonderful things out of that. And so this is kind of my philosophy in my program of research, to understand the generative nature of end of life and of reconciling with the end of our own lives or the end of other people's lives as, during the course of our own lifespan. Okay, and that's all I have for you. Thank you. I want to acknowledge my lab, the Life Story Lab at the University of Florida, specifically my PI, Dr. Susan Bluff, my lab mate, Shubham Sharma. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Strickland-Hughes for inviting me here, and Jacqueline Barron-Lee, who is my secondary mentor at the hospital where I collect palliative care data. So I'm open for any questions that you have at this point. Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of information on like how to get not the person who's dying, but like other people to get through their death. For people who know they're dying, what are some ways to help them kind of get through the process of like, oh, they're dying? Yeah,
I mean, I haven't specifically, actually I've done a little bit of research on that, but one of the things is early on, if you really know that this is the end of life, it's important in talking about this place of death thing to consider transitioning from hospital to hospice services. Hospice services are really great because they can be integrated into a hospital setting, they can be integrated into your home setting, or you can actually go to a hospice center to receive hospice services. So whatever your needs are, they can fulfill those. And people report, if they engage in hospice services at end of life, that they're really much more happier with their end of life experiences and that the family are so much more comforted at their end of life. So this is really, really important to understand. Like, if you want to give this the best case scenario for a lot of people and you know that they're terminal, to kind of reconcile with that and move on to this end of life care, which is hospice. The other thing that we're specifically doing as a project is looking at this new form of therapy called dignity therapy. It is specifically provided to people at end of life to offer them a sense of dignity. And basically how it works is it's a life review of sorts. It's a very brief life review where a therapist or chaplain comes in to wherever the patient is and talks about their life story and records it, usually just audio records it, and then they transcribe the entire life story and create what's called a legacy document. So this, first of all, allows the patient to feel this sense of dignity. My life was meaningful, look at all these amazing things I did. But it also allows the patient to provide something in written form to their loved ones when they die, this legacy document. This is my life story and I'm passing it on to you. And we've seen that that's something that's really comforting to people who are dying as well. So that's something you can do to kind of make that end of life experience better when you know that they're dying. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
For instance, like if someone were to die just out of this, not random, but like all of a sudden, do you think it'd have a bigger impact on someone than someone who you knew was going to die anyway?
Sort of, yes. We don't study traumatic death specifically, but when we are looking, another project that we're doing is looking into talking to young adults about their end-of-life wishes, because we know that young adults are much more likely than older adults to die suddenly. And when they do, they haven't usually figured out what they would prefer at end of life. So if you have a young adult who got into a car accident or got into a fight and is now comatose, we don't really know as a society what their wishes are, because they've never really discussed them, because they're young and they feel like they're immortal and they'll never die. And so one of the projects that we're working on right now is to actually introduce this concept to young adults, like, yeah, you're gonna die, what are your thoughts about it? What would you prefer? And to kind of try to start to communicate that with your family or with your provider so that they can do what's best for you. So that's most of the way that we integrate this sort of sudden loss into our research, is acknowledging the fact that young adults are more likely to die suddenly, and therefore should communicate their wishes, if they have any, for end of life soon. Even though it's unlikely that you're going to die when you're young, if you do, it's going to be more of this kind of sudden death. As far as it being more traumatic or not, there's actually not a lot of research on that, and that's not something that we do, but it's definitely something that affects the family in terms of having to make decisions if the person, if the young adult like enters a coma or something like that. Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. Do you study anything having to do with like methods of burial, or are you focused on kind of what you talked to us about? Because I mean, it seems like there's so many different things you can look at surrounding
end of life. Yeah, I have a really great program of research for the rest of my life. There's so much that I can do.
Until your sudden death.
Until my sudden death. I have an advance directive, so they know what they
Well, I was
should do.
thinking about like an eco-friendly burial.
Yeah.
And I tried to find some information at the library, and it was funny because this older librarian started telling me I should donate my body to science instead, and I'm like, well, I just want to like have a tree planted where like disintegrate into the ground.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So we don't really study that, but I think it's fascinating too, and I'm like a super nerd when it comes to my research, so like my fun reading is also about death, which is kind of pathetic, but I like it. So I read books about, like, I have this book right now that I'm reading about like the different burial processes, and there's a couple places in Colorado and maybe Oregon where they do these open air burial services where you're on a pyre basically. And it's just sort of kind of legal there, even though usually it's not. We have this weird notion that death has to be really medicalized.
But it almost seems like, can the formaldehyde and other stuff really be good in the ground? I mean, I don't know.
Right, well, you'd have to ask somebody else. But yeah, no, I mean, that's kind of out of my area of expertise. But in terms of people's personal wishes about whether or not they want their body pumped with formaldehyde, that's something that as a society we're just starting to re-investigate and say, oh, people who don't want that to happen to their body shouldn't have to, so let's offer these alternative, like these pyre services, which don't include any chemicals or anything like that. So I think it's interesting. We don't do any research on it though. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So we talked about comforting people that they're aware that they're going to die fairly soon.
Mm-hmm.
You said a good way to comfort is the place that they're at, so they feel more comfortable. Do you have any advice to give about they know that they're going to die and just comforting them like mentally, because like they're at that phase where like all their friends are dying, and like if their spouse dies, like how, like that's a really hard question, but like how can you best help them mentally?
Yeah, so you're talking specifically about older adults maybe who have lost a lot of people. Advice feels like I'm personally saying something, so I have no, and within the place of death thing, that's something that we're particularly interested in. There's a lot of different things that go into having a good, what's called a good death in the literature, having a good end-of-life experience. We're looking at place of death specifically because we think that's an understudied area, but there's a lot of other things like you're saying. I'm recently, there's a lot, I could say a lot about it, but I'm recently reading a book about final communication at end of life and how it's really important to take the dying person seriously, even though it seems like they're mentally out of it. So they communicate in different ways than most people do because they have less energy, or maybe because they're seeing things that you're not, they have certain there's like a pattern of visions or dreams that people have at that phase of life. And in fact, there's an interesting group of researchers up in Buffalo, where I'm from, and where I've done a project with, looking at end-of-life dreams and how they're kind of connected. People who are dying have really, really similar dreams across time, and when they try to communicate them, they're doing that to connect with their loved ones or with their provider at end of life. So that's kind of a piece of advice that's coming out of my head right now, is taking the conversation or the communication that those people are trying to give seriously, because they're not usually out of it. They're usually trying to communicate something important that is easy to miss if you're not looking for it. So that's another kind of thing that's important. But there's a lot of different things I could say. I was just reading about that yesterday, so that's the one that's coming to mind. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, so like just look up like research on a good death, you said?
Yeah, there's a lot of research on a good death, but if you specifically want to read about kind of providing that to patients, the book I'm reading right now is called Final Gifts. It's excellent. It's written by 2 hospice nurses, and it's talking about the importance of taking that communication at end of life seriously, because it's really helpful for the person who's dying to feel like they are communicating what they need to. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't know if that was like particular. Yeah, okay. There's also a lot of, literature research on a good death, this concept of a good death in literature. It's something that's a little bit contested, but something that I still kind of, it's part of my model of the end of life. So if you want to look up literature like that, you can just search a good death and you'll find a lot. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah?
So you mentioned like how the method of confronting loss could be like associated with like the death avoidance thing?
Yeah, it was connected to this death resistance.
Could you like expand more on like how you also said like it was kind of unhealthy?
That is something that's I'm kind of taking to the next level. So we didn't actually do any sort of, we didn't have any data relating it to unhealthy grieving, but in general there's a certain body of literature that's kind of coming out now and saying it's maybe not good to be remembering a loved one over time. And what I was trying to do in the paper that I wrote about this is say it's not necessarily a good or bad thing, it depends on how you're doing it. And that over time doing this confronting loss thing as your only form of memorializing or connecting to the loved one might not be the most healthy way, because you're just continuously reminding yourself that they've died instead of reminding yourself that you had a life with them, and that they had this beautiful life. So I think that the people who are coming up with this in the literature, who are coming up with this notion of like, oh, maybe it's not good to remember, they might be talking about these things specifically. And it's called continuing bonds, and it's something that's also kind of contested right now. Those researchers, the things that they're seeing that are unhealthy are things like pretending that the loved one's there even though they're not, or talking to them even though they're not. And they're saying those are not great things. That I would argue is kind of connected to this idea of confronting loss. You're grappling with the fact that they're dead, and you're trying to reconcile with the fact that they're not there anymore. And at the beginning that might be something you really need to do, but over time, if that's the only thing you're doing to connect to them, again, I think that that's not going to lead to the best grief symptomology over time. But yes, we didn't actually measure it, so it's something that I sort of have to just like slip in as my next step, and there's a lot that I could do with that memorializing next steps that I could take that I'm excited about. So other questions?
You mentioned that you recruited students as well as community members for your study. Can you talk a little bit more about that decision and like why you were sampling the population that way?
Originally, they built the study to look specifically also at people who had volunteered with hospice, and that was data that was looked at in a completely different way. But it was nice that we basically had 3 groups of people, and I didn't look at them in terms of group. I just looked at them in terms of the varying levels of experience that they had across all of those groups. But the 3 groups that we initially recruited were just college students who had little experience with death, people who had more experience with death, college students or community members, and then specifically recruiting people who volunteered for hospice. Why are you doing that? Why is that something that is important to you as a young adult? And so looking at whether or not any of that differed, and it really didn't, but it allowed us to get this nice sample of people who had varying experiences with loss, including some of the hospice volunteers had lost people that they were not close with, but it still was a loss that they experienced, someone who they had worked with in hospice who had died. That was only a few of the volunteers, but still it was nice to kind of have that diversity in the sample. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay. Any other questions? Okay, great, that's okay. Thank you so much for listening and for your attention. I really love talking about this stuff, and I love kind of showing people that it doesn't have to be a morbid topic. It's actually really interesting, and there's a lot to say about it, so I appreciate your time.
You have a question now?
No, I don't. This wasn't me raising it.